Welcome back to So What, the Imperfect Sewist, a place where we listen and don't judge. We instead focus on mind over matter as we walk with you through your beginner sewing journey, so you too can become a So What sewist. So, what are we sewing today?
If you just got a sewing machine, or maybe you've had one sitting in your closet, taking up space because you're terrified of messing it up, take a deep breath. Today's episode is made specifically for you. When you first start sewing, it's easy to feel like you need to know everything right away. How to install invisible zippers, sew complex tailored jackets, or draft your own pattern. But the truth is, you don't. Sewing is just a stack of simple, repeatable habits. And once you master a few core building blocks, you can create almost anything from hair accessories and tote bags to gorgeous garments. In today's episode, we're going to be breaking down the 10 essential sewing skills every beginner sewist needs to learn, and make sure you stick around for skill number 8. I got it this time, because skipping it is the number one reason beginner projects end up looking wrinkled and puckered instead of crisp and professional. So let's jump in. Skill number 1 is correctly threading your machine and winding your bobbin. So threading is the foundation of every single stitch. 90% of beginners, beginner machines, they glitch, they jam, they have loop thread issues, they skip stitches, and all of those things are just threading errors. Always thread your upper machine with the pressure foot up so the threading seats properly into the tension disc. Learn how to wind your bobbin evenly. Loosely or uneven bobbins can mess up the lower stitching. This is something that's very important. And if you're not sure about how to do that, get pre-wound bobbins. Those can work just as good as if you had if you do it yourself at home. And as a beginner, I actually do recommend them. Yes, it can start to add up funding wise or finance wise, but if you get a pre-wound bobbin, it takes away from you having to figure out, is it taut, is it right, is it loose, is it uneven? It just starts you off on a solid foundation, and as you continue to sew, you eventually catch your rhythm and know exactly what works with your sewing machine. Skill number 2, controlling your stitch speed and maintaining a seam allowance. Now, resist the urge to press hard on that foot pedal. I know, and if you're someone who has a heavy foot when you drive, this is one you need to pay attention to. Slow and steady wins the race. A few weeks ago, I talked about the types of sewing machines that are actually very good for beginner sewists, and the five things you needed to watch out for to make sure you had a sewing machine that was perfect for you. One of them being the ability to adjust the speed on your sewing machine. Being able to adjust it all the way down to slow ensures that you have a steady and even stitch. Understanding your seam allowance is more about knowing what a seam allowance is and reading through your pattern if you're working with a pattern. A seam allowance is the distance between the edge of your seam and where your needle punctures your fabric. So if this is the end of I'll use a piece of paper. If this is the end of your fabric and your needle goes here, this here is your seam allowance. So hopefully you understand how that works. The distance between the edge and your stitch line is what everyone refers to as the seam allowance. And usually it's about, some people go with 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch, or even a 2/5 of an inch. Like, it all depends on what you're trying to sew, or 3/4 of an inch, I'm sorry. So, or a 1/2 an inch. I've seen that before. It all depends on what you're trying to sew. So don't watch the needle when you're sewing. The best way to do this is to watch the fabric edge. So if your needle is going to obviously puncture your fabric, you want to watch the fabric edge and align that with the guidelines that are on your needle plate. Most sewing machines come with a needle plate that actually has some lining and some information there that will help you see where you are when you're sewing. Having that is very important. So when you're watching the edge against that needle plate, it makes a world of difference. So be sure to do that. Skill number 3 is actually starting and ending the seam the seams by using a back stitch or versus a locking stitch. Okay. So unsecured seams will unravel over time the second you handle or wash the fabric. So you want to make sure you're sewing 2 stitches forward and 2 stitches backwards by hitting the reverse button. And then you can sew over it again. Don't backstitch over delicate or sheer fabrics. That's a no-no, especially if you're working with something like silk. You want to be very careful. Unless you have the proper needle in there, it will puncture and potentially destroy your fabric. If you're working with something like crinoline or something like that, you want to make sure that you are not creating a situation that causes your fabric to pucker up. It can pull the fabric down into the throat plate and start a few once you start a few millimeters in. So be sure to watch the type of fabric you have, use the right needle, and just make sure you just ease into it going front and back stitching wise. Now let's talk about skill number 4, pivoting sharp corners perfectly. So how do you sew a crisp circle, angle, or all of that? That's great for envelopes, card holders, square totes, bags, and collars. The best way to do this is until you hit your seam allowance distance from the corner, you want to make sure you're able to lift your presser foot and turn your hand wheel so that the needle is fully down in the fabric. So you raise your presser foot and do that, and then you spin your fabric as you go and lower your presser foot as you resume your straight lines. This is important, and it's one area where I find that people usually panic when it comes to getting their doing corners. So what I recommend, like I said, if your needle, we'll assume this is your needle going down. What I recommend is you lift your presser foot, and then you turn and put it down, making sure your needle stays down. You're not lifting your needle, it's staying down. You just turn as you go and sew a few stitches, turn and go. What that allows it to do is it allows your needle to continue to work without missing stitches. And it also ensures that as you're sewing, you're also going around the curve. Again, another reason why it is extremely important that you get a machine that gives you the ability to adjust your stitch speed or your sewing speed. Now, we are 4 skills down and 6 more to go, including the secret weapon tool that I mentioned earlier, and this replaces endless measurements. But real quick, if you're finding this breakdown helpful, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps me as a YouTuber, and it also really helps the beginner community continue to grow. And if you want simple, beginner-friendly digital patterns designed specifically to help you practice these exact skills step by step, head on over to my website. They come with easy instructions so you can build your confidence without the stress. Now let's talk about skill number 5. Accurate measuring, grain lines, and cutting. So there is a very, very popular saying in the sewing world: measure twice, cut once. And that's important. I don't know of any sewist who has not made this mistake, either when they're in a hurry and then they just cut and then realize, ooh, that's the last of the fabric I had, and I didn't really take that into consideration when I was doing this. It is extremely important that you measure twice, because sometimes you think you have already accounted for a seam allowance and then you realize, oops, I didn't account for that. So when you're sewing, measure twice, even if you say, you know what, I know this, I got this. Still, measure twice, cut once, because once you cut that piece of fabric, you can't recut it unless you cut it too big, in which case you can actually reduce it. But even then, I will say use a seam allowance to make that adjustment versus actually cutting again, because once you cut, you can't undo that. So you also want to understand what a warp is, what a weft is, and the bias in woven fabrics. So I do have a class that I teach on Outschool where I talk about the 3 differences there, and you want to cut against the grain line. So if you have questions about that, leave it in the chat. I can do a separate individual video on each one of those. It wouldn't be long videos, but it'll be a video that explains to you, it comes with all the charts and everything, so you understand the difference between a warp, weft, and bias on your woven fabric. Now, cutting on grain makes your garment twist awkwardly. So if you have ever seen someone wear a dress and it just kind of pulls differently, they probably didn't cut that fabric on the grain, which means that it's going against where it's supposed to be. So when you use fabric shears, you ensure that you're using the right scissors or a rotary cutter with a self-healing mat. Just make sure you're looking also carefully to know where your grain line is and you're cutting against, or I'm sorry, you're cutting along your grain lines to make sure and not against your grain lines. Okay. Now, let's go to skill number 6, mastering the basic stitch types. There are 2 basic stitch types, and I also teach this during the class I teach online. First one being the straight stitch versus the zigzag stitch. Okay, it's the simplest way. They're decorative stitches and all the other things that come with it, but the most important thing you want to really master is straight versus zigzag, and I'll explain to you what they're used for. So the straight stitch is used for standard seam construction on woven or non-stretch fabrics. So most of your fabric, and I venture to say 85% of the projects you do will use a simple basic straight stitch. Everything. Like even things that come with gathers or shearing, you're using a basic stitch. Okay, you just eventually are able to loosen it and just go with it, to ensure you get the shearing, but you're still using a basic straight stitch. So that is very important. It's one of the most important skills. I cannot overemphasize that, and understanding your stitch width and length also is important for straight stitches. The next thing that's crucial for is when you're talking about zigzag stitches are 2 things. You use zigzag stitches primarily to finish raw edges to prevent fraying if you don't own a serger or if you don't own an overlocker. However, most modern machines these days give you the ability to do that, to use your regular machine to kind of finish the edges so that your fabric does not continue to fray after you've sewn it. And you also use the zigzag stitches when you're sewing stretchy knit fabric. So if you think things like sweaters, I'm wearing a stretchy top right now. I would use a zigzag stitch if I was sewing this just to ensure that it gives when it's going over my head. Obviously my head is not this small, but when it's going over my head, I need the ability to stretch it so that it can go through. And it allows the seam to stretch without breaking. So that's why it's also very important. So now let's talk about skill number 7. That's proper pinning and basting techniques. You want to pin perpendicular to your seam edge. So what that means is if this is the edge of your stitch and this is a pin, you're pinning perpendicular to that. You're not pinning this way, you're pinning this way. And that so that you can easily pull them out as you continue to sew along the straight line. The golden rule is you never sew over pins. I know, don't come for me. I see those videos on YouTube. I see those videos on TikTok. I see those videos on Instagram, on Facebook, everywhere. But let me just tell you, you never want to. And as someone who wears glasses, my biggest fear is for someone who does not wear glasses, who doesn't have the eye protection, where if you sew, and the needle comes down pretty fast. So if you hit the pin just at the right angle, it could break and could potentially jump into your eyes. So be extremely careful. Don't sew over pins. It can bend your needle, it can ruin your machine timing, or it can snap and the metal can get into your eye. So be very careful with that. Don't sew over your needle despite what you've seen online. And I know a lot of people like, my grandmother did that all the time and she was just fine. Wonderful. I'm so very happy that your grandmother is okay. However, the rule of thumb is you don't sew over the pins. Now, temporary long running stitches are called basting stitches. So when I was talking about creating gathers or shearing, this is one area where you would do that. Like if you wanted to have the ability to kind of squish, like let's say you don't have elastic thread, or you wanted to just do something that involves shearing or gathers on a skirt, this is where you would use a basting stitch because it doesn't lock on the ends. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to pull the threads and eventually kind of squish your fabric together. It's just a temporary long running stitch to hold tricky layers in place before finally using your machine sewing. So don't forget, a basting stitch is not a permanent stitch. It is designed to be temporary and eventually it has to come off. And now that's the skill number 8. If you have been following me for any period of time, this one should come as no surprise. Skill number 8 is pressing as you sew. This is a game changer. And as someone who personally, I think we should create a club for sewists who hate to iron. I'd probably run and be the president or the vice president. I don't like ironing. However, you cannot do without ironing when it comes to working on when it comes to sewing and having your product look finished. You absolutely have to iron. Ironing is not just for removing wrinkles at the end, or press. When you press your fabric during the construction, you set the thread into the fiber. It really just puts things together, and ironing does that as well. So you press every single seam at the iron before it intersects with another seam. Okay, so if you have a seam this way and this way, make sure that your iron is really going in there to kind of just really put things in there. Now, I know I've used two terms if you cut that. One was ironing and one was pressing. Those are actually two different things. So, and the biggest difference I can tell you is when you iron, you kind of go this way, all right, and you iron back and forth, and this kind of stretches the fabric. So that's you primarily used when you have wrinkles on your fabric and you just want to get things out of the get it smooth and flat and all of that and fully get it in its full shape. Now, pressing, however, is actually what you do to put the seams together, to put the thread and the fabric together. Think about it as the pastor in the church or someone who's joining two people in a marriage and say, I now pronounce you man and wife. That term pressing is the version of that term. Okay. It is marrying them together so that everything stays smooth and stays very crisp. So basically pressing is when you lift your iron and you really press it down. It does take a little bit of pressure, but you lift and you press down firmly. And I do have I had a clapper that I had shared a few weeks ago. I will link it here so that you can have that for use if you're ever, wondering what that looks like, or if you're ever wondering about pressing. The reason a clapper is very good is because it's a tailor's clapper. It's because it sits there and allows everything to set. So when you press, you have steam, and then the steam will sit in there, and then by adding the clapper on top of it, and you want a good clapper, you don't want one that's going to warp over time. By adding the clapper on top of it, it actually does keep everything kind of smooth and holds the heat there until you're ready to move on to the next place. Now let's talk about skill number 9, finishing your raw edges or preventing fraying on your fabric piece. Raw woven edges will shred. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And once they get in the washing machine, it might look great. Once it comes out and you're all good, it gets in the washing machine, you hand wash it or you do anything, it will start to fray. So zigzag stitching along the raw edges is a great way to prevent that. If you have pinking shears are basically things that they're regular scissors, but they have the jagged edges. I always think of Jaws every time I see that, and now I know I am pretty much aging myself right here. But think about it as using zigzags like a pair of scissors or the teeth, jaws, okay? So it kind of stops things. It clamps down on your fabric and ensures that it doesn't fray like you would. So if you have a fabric that is that frays easily, the threads come out fully. But then when you do a zigzag stitch or you use a pair of pinking shears, it actually prevents that because it's not all smooth anymore. So it gives a little bit more protection for the edge of your fabric. And that's very, very essential. So you want a clean finish to your fabric whenever you're working with anything. You want it to look good. You want it to come out crisp, and having either a serger or overlock or using a zigzag stitch will help that. If that's not available, pinking shears are just as good. Now let's talk about the last skill number 10, using a seam ripper without fear. Last week I had a live where I made a mistake. I mean, what else is new, right? But I made a mistake during my live, and it was very important for me to have my seam ripper handy. People don't value that as much, and sometimes they tend to think about it as a failure because they have to use a seam ripper. But let me be the first to tell you that is not the case. A seam ripper is usually a sign that you know what you're doing and you're ready to fix it if a problem comes up. And it means that you're able to recognize mistakes as they happen. It's not a sign of failure. It is an editing tool. So if you've ever typed on a word or I don't say we're perfect. Again, aging myself, Lord Jesus. But if you've ever used a typewriter or a keyboard and you were able to backspace, That's what a seam ripper does for you. It gives you the ability to go back a few stitches or to go back all stitches and just take everything out without having to completely cut out that area. So you want to know how to use a seam ripper, and that's important. I will also venture to say, even practice, like, you don't even have to make a mistake to practice using a seam ripper, okay? Sew a few straight lines and practice using your seam ripper to take it off. The correct way to do this is to slide a tiny red ball side inside the seam to cut the threads smoothly without puncturing your fabric. Okay, so you want to have the little red ball. Your seam ripper usually has a little red ball on one end, so you want to slide it inside the seam. It's always on the inside, and then the inside, it has a little bit of a U shape, will allow you, and I'm going to put a video so you can see what that looks like, will allow you to continue to push. You just apply a little bit of pressure to cut the threads smoothly without puncturing your fabric. So unpicking seams is how every great sewer learns, and and perfects their craft. So don't feel like you're a failure when you have to use a seam ripper. Now, there you have it. These are the 10 foundational skills that will take you from a nervous beginner to a confident sewist. You don't have to master all 10 today. Just focus on one project at a time and practice them continuously. Now, which of these 10 skills are you going to practice for your next sewing project? Drop me a comment below and let me know. And don't forget to visit my website for beginner-friendly sewing patterns. Be sure to click that subscribe button and check out the next tutorial on my screen to keep learning. Thank you for hanging out with me today. Happy sewing, and I'll see you in the next episode.